Welcome back to Reddit Discover channel.
H. Holmes created an apartment complex specifically to murder people. It was called the Murder Castle. Devil in the White City was a great book about Holmes and his murders. It's also going to be made into a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio as a star. He's the reason why the term serial killer exists. There's a great Supernatural episode on this too. Such an unpleasant guy. Unit 731. Heard of Joseph Mengele? These guys were doing similar fucked up experimentation in Asia, including germ warfare and this. Prisoners of war were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia. Vivisections were performed on prisoners after infecting them with various diseases. Scientists performed invasive surgery on prisoners, removing organs to study the effects of disease on the human body. These were conducted while the patients were alive, because it was feared that the decomposition process would affect the results. The infected and vivisected prisoners included men, women, children, and infants. The most fucked up thing about this is that most of them were granted immunity in exchange for their experiment data concerning germ warfare and some other things. I wrote a paper on this in middle school. I researched the ever-living fuck out of it, and I really wish I hadn't. This always makes me more angry of my country than a lot of other things. After the Germans lost and everything with the Holocaust was coming to light, we were justifiably stunned and disgusted and treated the Germans who were most responsible for orchestrating it accordingly. Then we discover this shit which is just as bad if not worse as anything the Germans did, and we let it all go, simply because they killed a greater number of their prisoners with experimentation instead of Zyklon B and we wanted the data. It's a disgrace. Vivisection. So much worse when you look up what that means. The story of Delphine LaLaurie is still one of the most horrifying and unnerving things that comes to mind when we are talking about shit that actually happened. She was a socialite in Louisiana who tortured and maimed her slaves. One day a house fire was started by one of her slave cooks who she had chained to a stove. The slave later said she started the fire as a way to kill herself. When police entered the house following the fire, they found slaves who were maimed due to all kinds of fucked up experiments LaLaurie had been doing on them. People had their limbs removed and reattached and stuff like that. Reportedly, some of them even begged to be killed. She was never caught. Fun fact, even with all its horrible history, Nicolas Cage bought and owned the LaLaurie house for a few years. Kathy Bates is one mean bitch. One of the scariest things I ever saw as a kid was a museum tour in New Orleans. There was a setup of Delphine LaLaurie chasing a male slave. She had a really awful face and the slave looked so utterly terrified. I had so many nightmares about it. Went on for years. Okay, but really, she named her children Mary Louise Pauline, Louise Mary Law, Mary Louise Jean, and Jean Pierre Pauline. Don't tell me that confusion didn't lead to her insanity. Most of the things attributed to her were added to the story years later. Not saying she wasn't cruel, but I don't think she ever made a human crab. Surprised not to see this here already. A man named Richard Parker is a character in a book. In 1838, Poe's only novel was published, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Partway through the book, the crew of a ship called Grampus finds themselves with a busted boat and no food or water. They manage to catch a tortoise and strip off its shell, but eventually, in order to survive, the crew draws straws to figure out which of them will be sacrificed to provide meat for everyone else. The death straw goes to a former mutineer named Richard Parker, who is promptly stabbed to death. His head, hands and feet thrown overboard. You can read the whole grisly thing here. This keeps the floating Donner Party alive a little bit longer, but the two remaining crew members are still on the brink of death when they are finally rescued. 40 years later, this happens. In 1884, a yacht named the Mignonette left England, headed towards Sydney, Australia. The yacht wasn't really made for trips around the world, so it shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone when it sank in a storm. The 4-man crew barely escaped in a lifeboat, but they definitely didn't have enough provisions for survival. They did catch a turtle and eat it, but just like their counterparts in the 45-year-old Potel, they needed more if they were going to be found alive when a rescue boat found them. One man, a 17-year-old named Richard Parker, fell overboard and then made the mistake of drinking seawater to attempt to quench his thirst. Parker started going downhill fast, and that's when his fellow survivors decided they would kill him to ensure their own survival. The men had considered drawing straws, but they figured Parker was so far gone they might as well kill him and drink his blood while it was fresh, instead of risking the contaminated blood that might occur if they just waited for him to die due to illness. After stabbing Parker in the throat with a penknife, the 3 men devoured him. They were rescued a few days later. And this is also why the tiger in Life of Pi, a story mostly set upon a lifeboat, was named Richard Parker. This is why Spider-Man doesn't have a dad. Obligatory world quote, life imitates art. Very strange. Human population was nearly eradicated 70,000 years ago. As I recall, wasn't that the apocalypse event that led to us becoming the dominant form of life on the earth? Always promising to remember that Yellowstone is due. The story of Gregory Rasputin and the circumstances of his death. It goes roughly like this. Rasputin was a very large man standing 6 feet 4 inches, 1.93 meters, and was a sort of advisor to the royal Romanov family of Russia. He repeatedly healed their fragile hemophiliac son, or so it is reported. He never really belonged to any specific sect per se, but was said to be a holy man. Many rumored him to be an agent of the devil or some possessed being. Pictures of the dude are creepy. Anyway, among political strife and rumors that Rasputin was seeking more power, he was ordered to be killed. He was given a nice meal laced with enough poison to kill several men. After a while, with no reaction, they promptly shot him in the back. Rasputin fell, but regained his strength and attacked his assailants. He was shot again in the head and beaten vigorously. They then wrapped him up and threw him in the Neva River. Later it was discovered that Rasputin had attempted to claw out of the ice and finally drowned. This guy, rumored to have supernatural powers along being very large and creepy, survived thorough poisoning, shots to the back and head, beaten and thrown in the river, and finally drowned under the ice. Edit. Wow, this blew up. It should be mentioned that historians are not 100% sure how it happened, and most agree that some of it simply isn't true. You forget he was Russia's greatest love machine. Also, they cut off his penis. It was supposed to be massive. Not sure where I heard this, but apparently when his body was being burned, he sat up. Although this is somewhat explained by the tightening of certain ligaments in the hips and legs while they were roasting. He didn't drown, he died of hypothermia. There was no water in his lungs during his autopsy. The Brazen Bull was a torture and execution device that basically roasted the person alive. It was a hollow brass bull with a door on the side. The victim would be locked inside. A fire was lit underneath the bull and a special design of tubes caused the steam to imitate the bellowing of a bull. Legend has it, with some fairly convincing evidence, that the designer of the bull was locked inside to see if his creation was true to the description. You can read more about the Brazen Bull and other interesting execution and torture methods here. Let no one say Phalaris was unfair. Backquote, his words revolted me. I loathed the thought of such ingenious cruelty and resolved to punish the artificer in kind. Receive, I cried, the due reward of your wondrous art. Let the music master be the first to play. Actually, the tubes in the bull were more designed for the steam that came off of the roasting victim to be made into bull bellowing, but pretty accurate otherwise. Ever play Amnesia: The Dark Descent?